and we'll see what happens with that.
Sure. Cool. Well, this is great.
Very good looking panel we have. Awesome. Now can you hear me? Am I on? Am I on? What? Oh, there we go. I'm on. That's fantastic. Hey, welcome everybody. I know you're eating and drinking. We're going to start the policy panel in moments, minutes, literally, as soon as I'm done talking. So if you want to come forward and you can get a little bird's eye view of the panel, bring your food, bring your drink. Just, leave a chair between you, or stand where you are. Do what you want. Really, it's a holiday happy hour and policy panel. Here's the panel. There's the holiday happy hour. My name is Peter Franzen. I'm the Associate Executive Director of CEAM. I know because I wrote it on this piece of paper earlier today. The Children's Education Alliance of Missouri, we just call it CEAM. And the rest of the CEAM staff is here as well tonight. If you don't know who they are, Laura Slay is our Executive Director, waving in the back. Cece Tompkins is our Parent Engagement and Outreach Manager, and Nick Elms is getting a little slider back there, and he is our Communications Manager. We are a small but mighty team, and speaking of small but mighty teams, we have a great board of directors, and a couple of them are here, notably our board president, Brian Murphy, who I'm going to introduce in a minute, and Dave Schmidt, our board treasurer, is back there, and Eleanor Maynard as well, our board secretary, is back there, so it's great that they're here as well. So tonight we've invited you to network with us and each other as well and hear the insights of these policy experts who you're going to meet in just a minute. But I do want to share with you a little about CEAM because CEAM lifts the issue of education reform in the public space, and we raise awareness across the state. And then we prepare parents to be agents of change through advocacy training. And then we help those parents take action and actually create change. And I think what's important to know about CEAM is that we really bring heart to the education conversation that is sometimes not there in the data and the statistics because we build relationships with parents and we give them the tools that they need really to become warriors for changing the laws that impact their children's lives. And I've seen those stories in action and the impact that it makes to have parents engage with legislators, and that's why I believe so much in the work that CEAM is doing. You can join our little network tonight, our growing network of folks. If you have a cell phone, you can text CEAM to 52886, and you'll be part of that CEAM activation network, and we'll let you know when things are happening and opportunities for you to take action. And if you want to find out more about how CEAM raises awareness, on January 25th, we're celebrating our poetry contest that has been open to St. Louis area students and will be culminating at a venue called The Stage at KDHX in Grand Center, and you can find out more about that. It's going to be a fun night. But right now, CEAM is building relationships with more parents in more parts of the state, and honestly, we can't do it alone. And awareness efforts like this policy panel and other live events around the state, along with lots of social media, along with advocacy training like the training that 30 St. Louis charter parents are going to be taking part in over a 4-week training in January here in St. Louis, and another 50 private school parents will be taking part in a Saturday session over on the Kansas City side of the state, and facilitating action like the many parents and legislators meetings and testifying before committees and letter writing and sharing on social media and engaging other parents. All that is going to happen in 2018, and it all requires resources. This year, we put our annual gala celebration on a sabbatical for a year, not because we don't love it, not because we don't think it's an important platform, but because we have really focused all of our efforts on expanding our parent action network from here to Kansas City and points in between. So you have an outreach sponsorship form at your seat or at the tables back there, and I really urge you to support this important work and to support the hundreds of parents that'll be becoming thousands and taking action to improve educational outcomes for all Missouri students. So if you're ready to commit your support to the work that we're doing, I urge you to do that. See me tonight, and I'll explain how you can do that. We all thank you in advance for your support of CEAM, in being here and learning about the issues and taking action, and for your financial support of what we do. So, thank you for coming. I'm going to turn it over to our board chair, Brian Murphy, so we can get on with this policy panel. Brian?
Thank you, Peter. That's a great explanation of the great work that we're doing at CEAM to try and reimagine education. We're here tonight. My task tonight is to introduce our moderator. The moderator for the evening is a person who I consider a friend, because we always keep showing up at the same kind of places, always around the same types of issues. Jeff's the Executive Vice President of Concordance Academy, which is a new nonprofit focusing on helping formerly incarcerated folks and helping them successfully transition into the community, which he put the arm on me for to help with that also. Previously, Jeff was a professor of urban policy at the New Schools Milano Graduate School, where he researched and taught urban political economy, policy analysis, campaign management, legislative strategy, and incarceration. Jeff seems to have a passion for issues that affect urban communities. And as you see, it's jobs, which he works on, housing, which is another area where we also collaborate with the Low Income Housing Trust Fund, and the work that he did in the legislature for the historic tax credit that really powered a lot of developments here in the city and now in all parts of the state. And for what we're here for today is education. From 2006 to 2009, Jeff represented the city of St. Louis in the state senate. He was my state senator. And before that, he ran for office for Congress. And before that, he co-founded the Confluence Academies, which are a group of city charter schools. Jeff has an extensive background as an educator with positions held at Washington University, UMSL, and Dartmouth College. He's written 3 books. I showed him, I got 2 of them. I bought 2 of them, Jeff, so it's, you know. Oh, man, come on, man. And he has published articles. He's a man about town. He does so much stuff. He's got articles published for Politico, the New York Times, CNN, New York Magazine. He also has a very successful TED Talk, which I would encourage you all to take a look at, on prison entrepreneurship, and it has garnered over 1 million views. He serves on the national boards of the Prison Entrepreneurship Program, the American Prison Data Systems. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with degrees in African American Studies and Political Science. And he earned an MA and PhD in Political Science from Washington University. He also has the distinction of being a graduate of Ladue Horton Watkins High School, which is where my son went to high school at also. So without any further ado, we're just very pleased to have a guy like this that's a worker and a thinker and is committed to what we know is very, very important for all of us in this community and our children. So I'm happy to introduce and to thank our moderator for this evening, Mr. Jeff Smith.
That was so nice. Brian, thank you so much for the kind introduction. That was wonderful. I mean, I wrote it, obviously. We all read our own bios. But usually people chop it, like they cut it in half, you know, and then it doesn't sound as good. But anyway, seriously, appreciate your friendship and all the work you do. And it's just a pleasure having you in so many different causes that I'm involved with, because there's a lot of people out there in this city and in this region who talk the talk. There aren't nearly as many who walk the walk. And when I started work at Concordance Academy about a year ago, Brian was one of the first people I called, because a lot of the guys who come out of prison that we work with at Concordance, they don't have very good educations. And in fact, nearly all of them dropped out of high school. Most have formally, on average, our participants have 9 grades of education. So Most of them, however, they want to work, and they want to work hard. And so one of the first things I did was call up Brian and say, hey, would you be interested in considering some of our guys to work at your firm to do construction? And he stepped up. And we need other employers throughout the region to step up, because we know that the overwhelming majority of people who come out of prison in this country end up going back to prison, about 3 out of every 4. And one of the main reasons they go back is because they're unemployed. The majority of people who are unemployed a year after their release end up going back before the 2-year mark. And of course, the reason most are unemployed is prison, of course, but compounded by poor education. Poor education in predominantly urban public schools. And I think that's the reason that we're here tonight. And it's the reason that all of you do the work that you do every day. And so I'm going to just open, before we get to the panelists, by talking briefly about some of my experiences in urban education in St. Louis. I went, as Brian said, to the University of North Carolina. I majored in African American Studies. And my dad always thought that was ridiculous. I'll never forget him saying to me after my sophomore year, after I had to declare my major, he said, look, we're not going to pay for you to go to school anymore unless you change your major. He said, if you want to be a doctor, go pre-med. If you want to be a lawyer, do pre-law. But I hate to break it to you, you're never going to be an African American. I was really interested, though. I always felt that if we were going to do anything to kind of bridge the stark racial gaps in our society today, groups on all sides have got to learn the history of groups on other sides. And one of the things that you kind of learn growing up, and I think this has changed for the better since I was in school, but at that point, pretty much, everybody has to learn mainstream American history. But not many white people learn Latino American history. Not many white people learn African American history. And I thought, to be credible as someone who aspired to bridge this gap, I wanted to learn the history of African Americans in our country. So I did that. And I wanted to come back to St. Louis and teach, ideally teach history and specialize in black history in St. Louis public schools. And so I applied to do just that. But I couldn't get a job doing that because I didn't have a teaching certificate. Instead, St. Louis Public Schools did hire me to evaluate the certified teachers. Now, so at the time I was really disappointed because I wanted so badly to be in a classroom. It turned out to be a blessing in disguise because over the course of my time there, I got to visit over 60 different schools in the district and learn so much more than I probably would have learned in a single classroom about what actually made a teacher an effective teacher, what made a principal an effective school leader, and what were the key factors that could really potentially drive school success. I saw so much both in schools and at the central office where I worked out of that caused me distress. I'll never forget sitting in one classroom and just watching a teacher. I introduced myself at the start of the class. My name's Jeff Smith. I'm from the Division of Research and Evaluation, from the central office. And I'll be here visiting your class today. Thank you very much for letting me, observe. The teacher then handed out 25 dittos and read a magazine. And I always wondered what that teacher did when she wasn't being observed. Another teacher, a social studies teacher at the high school level, was teaching a lesson about the separation of powers and was talking about the judiciary and said, was talking about elections and said, the reason that all these, elections are so important is because, who are we going to elect to be on, the Supreme Court? Who are we going to elect, in some of these key judicial? And it was a very frustrating job because I watched that day as a very intelligent sophomore in that class said, well, I don't think we elect our Supreme Court justices because remember, during the race, you heard like Dole and Clinton were talking about the kind of justices that they'd appoint. And the teacher replied, look, I voted last November and you didn't because the kid, wasn't 18 yet. And I know, I closed the curtain and there were judges on there. I voted for them. And I, because of the rules of my position, had to just sit and watch this. And so there were several times that I would pull students aside who would, ask questions afterwards and say, you were right about that. Stay on that. Keep learning. There was, of course, also bureaucratic dysfunction that I witnessed. There were a couple moments that really stood out. There was one where our administrative leader for our division, she walked by and she had a big stack of legal pads and pens. And she said, legal pads, and I held up my legal pad. And I had 2 more legal pads on my desk. And she said, legal pads? And I said, I'm good, I got a few. And then she dropped 3 more legal pads on my desk. And I walked after her and I said, Dolores, I don't need all these. And she just shook her head at me and didn't accept them back. And then another staff person came and visited me about 5 minutes later and said, don't you get it? If we don't use everything that we were given for the year, then they'll cut our materials budget for next year. And yet, the materials that were critical to learning at the school level, people weren't quite as interested in those. I remember visiting a school the week before Thanksgiving and seeing a classroom that still didn't have their textbooks yet. And I went to the central office and the teacher was just begging me, can we get our textbooks? And I went into the textbook place and I tried to explain that I worked there and what the school was, what the grade was, what the textbook was. And the person who appeared to be in charge told me, you know what, the person who covers that isn't around right now. He's out. I think he'll be back after Thanksgiving. To think that there was that little urgency, that another couple weeks would go by, and it wasn't important enough to say, you know what, let's figure out right now how we can fix this and get books to that school. Well, it opened my eyes. And I'll tell you, I saw some amazing people working in the system. My boss, my first boss, he was amazing. And he was doing everything he could. And I saw some amazing teachers who were absolute gems and some school leaders who were inspiring. But I saw too many instances like the one that I just described. A long time ago, I think, I don't want to mangle the quote or misattribute it, but I believe it was in the late 60s, and someone said, a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. Now, I don't consider myself a conservative. I actually, lean to the left. But after my experience in St. Louis Public Schools, I decided to get involved with the founding of Confluence Academy. Because in my view, at that point, a charter school proponent was a former St. Louis Public School bureaucrat who had been mugged by reality, who had worked within the system and seen so many instances of a system that sadly failed to work. Confluence was, and if you wonder why I keep mispronouncing that, it's because now I work at Concordance, and I co-founded Confluence, and so just the emphasis on the syllables sometimes trips me up. But I learned a lot with Confluence. We made mistakes, like I think most startups do. We grew too fast, and I think it's a lesson that a lot of charter schools some have not heeded, in St. Louis, but some have heeded. I think it's been wonderful to watch schools like the Biome School, like City Garden, that have been really intentional about growing slowly, getting it right, and then moving, up a grade level, 2 grade levels, or, expanding. We took out too much debt, wanted to expand too fast. We went, I think, in our first year to second year from like 210 students to 670, adding multiple grades at once. That was a big mistake. We didn't have the school culture right. We didn't have top-notch administrative leadership that was able to expand fast enough. And that's the second key lesson, that I learned is without stable and excellent leaders at each school, it doesn't matter how many good frontline teachers are, they need that type of leadership and support if they're going to stay and feel nourished and nurtured. So that was the second lesson that I learned. And a third key one, which is one that I know CEAM is working hard on and has worked hard on for a while, is the critical importance of parental engagement. It's important on a lot of levels. The first is probably most obvious. We don't learn things that neurologists tell us until you see it 10 times. And if you learn something at school, but it's not reinforced at home, it's going to probably be a lot less likely to really be absorbed. And so parental engagement is so critical to ensuring that the, what's it called, Robin, the summer?
Learning loss.
The learning loss in the summer slide, by which so many students learn during the school year, but then if they're not exposed to the right types of experiences, the right types of reinforcement, then it all goes away. And the first 2 or 3 months of the next school year are spent reviewing what was learned in the past school year. And so parental engagement helps mitigate that learning loss and actually accentuate the gains as opposed to undermining them. Second key reason for parental engagement is, of course, one of the reasons we're here tonight is advocacy. Nobody is going to tell a story of the importance of school choice better than a parent who benefits from it. There's no teacher, there's no principal, there's no corporate partner, there's no school board member, no one who can tell the story as effectively as a parent who was disappointed when she didn't have options, who is now invigorated and engaged, and whose child is succeeding. As a legislator, a former senator, I can tell you firsthand, the people who succeed the most, the advocates, the groups who succeed the most in this state are the groups who are the most mobilized. The 3 groups that were the most successful when I was a senator were the midwives, the freedom of the road riders, who don't want to wear motorcycle helmets, and the noodlers. Raise your hand if you know what a noodler is. Okay, got some people who grew up in the country, right? The noodlers are people who like to fish with their hands.
Catfish.
And I tell you what, not one of those groups gave a dime to a politician. But when there was an alert sent out to their members, every single one of those groups would have the hallways crawling with hundreds, if not thousands, of grassroots activists. Every single district in the state had midwives. Every single district in the state did not necessarily have noodlers, but more than you think. And I'll tell you, it's the passion of those grassroots activists that carry the day. When I went on later to my time as an academic, one of the research projects that I did was a study of the 2001 session of the Missouri legislature. And I was able to get some very rare data, a data set so unique, I've never seen another political scientist get this data. I'm not very good at political science, but my big value add was that as a former senator, I could get my hands on data that nobody else could. And so I asked several of my former colleagues if they would give me all the tracking of all the constituent service interactions that they'd had during that whole session. All of the phone calls, all the letters, all the emails, and all the visits. And you know what I found? After looking at all that data and also looking at groups that had taken a formal position on behalf of a bill and testified, and they'd made contributions, that contributions had an impact on whether a bill failed or succeeded, but only in a vacuum. Money only mattered when constituents didn't weigh in. Once constituents weighed in on behalf of or against a particular piece of legislation, the influence of the money dropped out, and the influence of the constituent contacts increased, such that once a bill had an average of just 8 contacts to a legislator against it, there was a 99.2% chance that it failed. Similar, although not quite as dramatic numbers in support of bills. And that's because of the structure of the Missouri Senate, for the most part, which is that it's much easier to kill a bill than it is to pass a bill. So a few of the bills that I worked on, I'll just talk for another couple minutes, and I'm sorry that I'm delaying the panel so much, but about my time in the legislature and a couple things that I worked on. And I want to first start out with getting there. The campaign, I'll never forget, I went to interview for the AFT endorsement in my first race. Because I thought, you know what, I could maybe get their endorsement. I'm very supportive of higher pay for teachers, and I'm supportive of early childhood education, down to age 3, fully funded by the state. I certainly had some policy planks that I thought would make me a candidate to get the AFT and the NEA's endorsement. I sat in front of the AFT, and they went around the room, introduced themselves, and then asked me the first question. They said, "Are you prepared to disavow your affiliation with Confluence Academy and the charter school movement?" I said, "No, but I would love to talk about some things that we have in common, like early childhood education, and a couple other points." And they said, "Well, I'm sorry, we won't have the opportunity to do that. The interview is over." So my first interview with the AFT lasted about 90 seconds. And that really disheartened me, because I always tried to view myself as someone who wanted to take the best of all sides and listen to arguments on all sides and then see what the evidence bore out about what worked. And regrettably, I think both sides have been guilty of not doing that, both sides of the education debates. A couple of the issues that I worked on in the legislature, I worked on differential pay. That means allowing teachers in certain areas geographically or certain subject areas to make more money. The reason I got so interested in this is that when I looked at the figures on the percentage of math and science teachers in St. Louis public schools that lacked certification, the year that I was in the legislature, that I started the legislature, nearly 30% of all science teachers, high school science teachers in St. Louis public schools, people occupying the classroom at that point, were not certified to teach science. The numbers in math weren't much different. It was like 21 or 22%. Most of those rooms, a lot of them were occupied by full-time subs because they couldn't attract people with those specialties. And so I thought, hey, what about a $5,000 bonus that wouldn't come from the school district itself, but would come from state general revenue to incentivize new math and science teachers, newly hired math and science teachers in St. Louis public schools? And that was vehemently opposed by St. Louis public schools, even though it was a way to, I thought, upgrade the quality and credentials of applicants into areas where nearly a third of the people teaching were unqualified. I supported pay-for-performance legislation and sponsored some that would have helped change the way that in unaccredited or provisionally accredited districts, we paid our teachers. It wasn't because I was 100% sure that it would work. It was because what we were doing wasn't working. And I wanted to try to experiment. And really, that's so much of what this movement is about, is trying new things to see if they will work. Looking so that we can form an evidence base for innovative, successful programs. And of course, charters and other forms of school choice, most notably open enrollment, were also things that I supported. And was lonely in supporting them as the only Democrat in the Senate Democratic Caucus to support all of that legislation. But it was important to me. And frankly, it highlighted the hypocrisy of some of my caucus colleagues. People who said they stood for the least of them, stood for those children in society who were most vulnerable, hungry, getting a substandard education, and said they strongly opposed school vouchers because they didn't think there should be that type of private influence in public education. And I said, okay, I can understand that philosophical argument. So why don't we just have open enrollment where in Chesterfield, we can open up the Parkway schools or the Rockwood schools or the Ladue schools to kids from anywhere? What's your philosophical dispute with that? Well, that will never work. Have you heard of the St. Louis school desegregation program, the largest voluntary public school desegregation program I think ever tried in the history of the United States, that worked pretty darn well for a couple decades and still works for those school districts in St. Louis County that want to remain a part of it? So that sort of hypocrisy bothered me. And I am heartened to see a variety of movements that I've been involved in, tangentially at least, like education reform and like criminal justice reform, beginning to attract more and more people from all sides, both sides of the aisle and all sides of the public debate. So thank you for indulging me on my little screed there. I'm going to now I want to turn to the panelists, and I want to start by introducing them. We are so excited to have such a diverse group of people who are involved in this issue from so many different angles joining us tonight. I'll start on that end with Chuck Wolf. Chuck Wolf is Vice President of School Development for K-12, Inc., the nation's leading provider of digital learning solutions for grades pre-K through 12. In this role, he works with state agencies, school districts, and charter schools to help develop innovative online platforms to serve students in both full-time virtual and blended environments. His primary emphasis recently has been on the development of career-focused programs that integrate collaborative partnerships. He previously served as executive director for Insight School of Colorado and was part of the leadership team that launched the Insight School of Kansas. Chuck started his career as a math and social studies teacher in Camdenton R3 School District. They noodle in Camdenton? I bet they do.
There's a few noodlers down there.
A few noodlers down there in south central Missouri. He then went to law school and worked as a corporate transactional attorney for major firms and national corporations before starting a second career in education. Prior to joining K-12, he worked with National American University as the director of legal studies and campus director in the KC region. In this role, he helped develop and manage the paralegal program and served as the chief administrator for 2 campuses. Chuck earned a bachelor's in education from the University of Missouri and a law degree from UMKC. Great to have you here, Chuck.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Sure. Now I'd like to introduce Bill Kent. Bill is founding president and CEO of Biome Charter School, has led Biome's Youth Learning Center since its inception. Recognizing that so many of the boys he grew up with didn't have the family support that he enjoyed, and that many of those boys ended up in prison, Mr. Kent was moved to leave his business career and dedicate his professional life to improving academic and life outcomes of youth from under-resourced backgrounds. He applied his background in business management to directing the original YLC building project in 2010, as well as the 2015 renovation. He's also overseen the development of programming from an all-volunteer organization to the current organization, providing STEAM education through outreach programs, and eventually the founding of the Biome School in 2015. The school offers customized, project-based, and student-centered learning opportunities with an emphasis on growth mindset and STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math education. The school creates a balanced learning ecosystem in which teachers work together with students to cultivate a growth mindset as they discover their unique gifts, talents, and interests. Bill earned his Bachelor of Science from Lindenwood University and joined YLC after serving as a manager and career insurance underwriter with Reliable Insurance for 13 years. Great to have you here, Bill. Next, we have Robin Wabi. Robin serves as founding executive director of the Missouri Charter Public School Commission. Prior to her appointment there, she served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Mayor Francis Slay, where she provided direction and advice on education and children's policy, among other areas. She began in 2001 and led the city's K-12 school reform effort. In 2006, she developed and directed the mayor's strategy to expand quality public charter schools within the city of St. Louis. Over the next 9 years, 28 new public charter schools opened and several poor-performing schools were closed. She also worked with the city's private and parochial schools to assure all St. Louis families had an array of quality options, several of which she took advantage of herself with kids who attended charter schools, magnet schools. I don't think you ever had a parochial school child.
No.
But your husband's a parochial school grad.
Yes.
Prior to joining the mayor's office, Robin held a variety of leadership positions in public, private, and nonprofit organizations, and served as an elected member of the St. Louis Board of Education. She serves as a member of the board of directors for the National Association of Charter School Authorizers and was recently honored as one of CEAM's Champions of Education Reform. Welcome to the panel, Robin.
Thank you.
Does the Q stand for Quinn?
Quinton.
Quinton, okay. Michael Q. McShane is Director of Education Policy at the Show Me Institute and an adjunct fellow in Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He's nationally recognized for his work in evaluating school choice programs and examining state and federal level policies. A former high school teacher, he earned a PhD in education policy from the University of Arkansas, a master's in education from the University of Notre Dame, and a BA in English from St. Louis University. And was a teacher in, I believe, Montgomery, Alabama. So you've been kind of a nomad all over the place. McShane's analyses and commentary have been published widely in the media, including in the Huffington Post, National Affairs, USA Today, and the Washington Post. He's also been featured in education-specific outlets, such as Teachers College Commentary, Education Week, Phi Delta Kappa, and Education Next. In addition to authoring numerous white papers, he's had academic work published in Education, Finance, and Policy and the Journal of School Choice. He's the editor of New and Better Schools, the author of Education and Opportunity, and co-editor of Teacher Quality 2.0 and Common Core Meets Education Reform. Mike, great to have you here. So let's go in reverse order. Mike, we're a little bit at a crossroads here with our federal education policy, and we'll start big and then we'll kind of come into Missouri. Talk to us about what federal education policy, what impact it will have on Missouri as we go through a lot of changes.
Sure.
Secretary DeVos is certainly bringing a different perspective than that which we had for the last 8 years. And talk to us about where you think we're going.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have probably seen the high water mark of federal involvement in education with the sort of bipartisan efforts of both No Child Left Behind in the Bush administration and then with Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind waivers that came out of the Obama administration, with the now slightly less recent passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was a bipartisan effort. We had Patty Murray from Washington State and Lamar Alexander. I think both sides of the aisle recognized that the federal government had been having a little bit too heavy of a hand in trying to manage local school districts and states. They wanted to push some of the accountability policies and teacher evaluation, other those things, back down to the state level.
How many states had waivers?
So I mean, by the end of it, gosh.
45?
Yeah, 40, in the 40s. Yeah, I think somewhere, basically almost everybody. So we already had this kind of patchwork system, and I guess they basically just sort of codified that into law. So now, with the new administration coming in, there was obviously a much greater appetite for school choice programs, but you know, the Republican coalition and I think the sort of Trump administration and others has some kind of conflicting factions within it. There is a non-trivial part of the Republican coalition that wants the Department of Education to not exist. So anything that it does is going to run into issues. There are some that, you know, going back to the sort of No Child Left Behind era and others, that want actually a more muscular federal role around things like accountability and others. So that was a difficult situation to navigate. There was thought of passing like a large federal tax credit program for K-12 education. I don't really see that happening. They've expanded the use of 529 accounts so that people could pay for private education. But I think it's mostly we're going to see from the federal government with respect to school choice, a lot of stuff kind of tinkering around the edges, and just sort of generally speaking, a less active federal role in other aspects of education policy.
If you don't mind, I'm going to sneak over to
Oh,
that
yeah, go
stool
ahead.
over there. But no, that's interesting about the can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, the 45 waiver. So I mean, it's not even really No Child Left Behind is, you know, an artifact basically if well, sorry about that. If 45 states are already opting out of these requirements.
Yes.
That's like when I tell my kids, like, no, you can't have dessert, you know, for breakfast, and then I give them Lucky Charms.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, you had
the policy doesn't mean anything.
Sure, I mean, you had a law when passed in 2001 and signed in the beginning of 2002 that set a 100% proficiency goal by 2014,
Right.
with the belief that there's no possible way that it would not be reauthorized in the interim period. Well, it wasn't. And so, yeah, all of these states were running up against this agreement that they had made that 85% of their kids, 90% of their kids would be proficient, and we're nowhere close to it. So they kind of had the federal government over a barrel. They were sort of over a barrel themselves. And so that's how this sort of deal was hashed out.
So you mentioned education savings accounts.
Yes.
Take us in a little more depth on that
Yeah,
issue.
so-
And help us delineate between education savings accounts and vouchers or tuition tax credits.
Sure. So a school voucher, the easiest way to think about it is just like a coupon, right? So the state or whatever organization is paying for it says there's some amount of money in this coupon that you can take to a school to exchange for one education, right? That's sort of the way that it's worked out. Tax credit scholarships are another way of sort of financing that, where the coupon is paid for by individual or corporate donors who then get a credit for being able to do it. What an education savings account is imagine rather than being treated as a coupon, having a flexible use spending account. So lots of us might be familiar with HSAs from the medical field, where rather than just going to one provider, you have an amount of money that's in there that can be split amongst multiple providers. So it could be schools, it could be tutors, it could be online resources, it could be any of those sorts of things. Now, they're a little bit different. The state, when we talk in the state about creating education savings accounts, those are generally referring to K-12 students with the money not coming from their own parents. Their money is coming from other folks to pay for their education. Because nothing in this life can be easy, there are also education savings accounts like 529 accounts that are savings for college, which generally it's students' own parents, even though other people can contribute to them in some. So there's a little bit of clarity. It would help if whoever the powers that be were had given these things different names, but that's basically the sort of lines of delineation between all of them.
All right. I learned a lot in 3 minutes there. Thank you, Mike. So Robin, let me ask you, we've seen certainly an upheaval at the federal level in terms of some of the policies that are being put forth. At the state level, we've seen a similar upheaval, very recently at the State Board of Education. Can you talk a little bit about kind of where you see things going policy-wise in the legislature, and how the recent move at the State Board of Education kind of interacts with where you see things going legislatively?
Yeah, there was an upheaval. If anybody was living under a rock in the last couple of weeks, the State Board of Education voted to terminate the contract of the seated Commissioner of Education. And it caused a lot of anxiety because those State Board of Education members, which are appointed by the governor, are typically appointed with long terms, and so that one or maybe two appointments are made by a governor, typically, never 5. And so having that many open seats available to one governor,
Really, he was just seizing an opportunity that Governor Nixon laid in his lap.
Yeah,
by not appointing people to those vacancies.
Right. So I think we hear one half of this story about the governor sort of muscling and getting his people in in the seats. What we failed to have a lot of information about has been why those seats were vacant. And I think the previous governor, and people will need to ask him directly, but I believe that those seats, individuals served in expired terms, really allow the governor to weigh in with that individual board member. If you want to stay there, you need to do what I need you to do, and if you're not, I'm going to pull you at any moment's notice. And so the sort of politicizing of the State Board of Education by this governor, I mean, state boards of education have always been political animals, and they're established that way. So the governor appoints. So yes, there has been an upheaval. I really think that the outgoing commissioner had a really steady hand and is an absolute wonderful person, and I'm certain will have much success moving forward. Was really not at all about what she was or wasn't doing, but I think that what the governor really wants to see, if I understand the policy correctly, is that he really wants to have a board that's more aggressive and more bold. I think there was some disappointment by the governor on the ESSA plan that was submitted by the state. I don't think it was bold enough around choice, and I think that in particular around teacher quality and teacher pay issues too. And so I think he was making a statement about the importance of education in Missouri, his seriousness of this. And so these new individuals that have to be confirmed by the Senate will have
What do you
to
think?
swim some more political waters. I think that I think
Clearly
it'll be
there's some
highly
dissatisfaction.
unlikely that these individuals who took this action will see the consent of the Senate. And so I think that we'll be seeing some more upheaval for a while. And that's
So the process,
Senate's
so
right.
if they're not confirmed within 30 days by the Senate, then the governor can do new recess appointments who can sit on the board until next January.
Yeah, I think that would have
And we
to
could
be
just
made out
have
of
a
session.
series of appointments where if he doesn't figure out some way to develop consensus with some of the people who are distressed by the recent decision, we may just have board members serving for 11 months at a time.
Yeah, again, I think the previous governor had some similar issues, and
Yeah.
because he didn't have the kind of necessary relationship with the Senate, I think some of the appointments didn't go forward, and I think that does not bode well for us as a government. We really actually have to find a way to compromise. I think many of the people, and I don't know them personally, I've just watched them work and I've read their bios. I mean, I think that the governor found really great Missourians to serve our children, and so I don't think, too, that this is about them any more than it was about Commissioner Van Dieven. I think this is other wars that are going on. I think it's in the best interest of Missouri and the best interest of our children if people will step up for them first, settle this down, and then actually get to what's really important, which is how are we going to hold our schools accountable? And I think that's the other answer to your question, is where are we going from a policy perspective? The current State Board of Education has tabled the new Missouri School Improvement Program, which is the program that we use to hold our school districts accountable. And so right now we're kind of in limbo. We're running the course with the current, which is MSIP 5. And I think that there's been some concern again about not really having credible accountability measures and kind of doing accountability light, or kind of making weight measures that are not really around what's beneficial to children's academic performance, but more about things that are easy to count. And that's not the way to do accountability.
Yeah. So Bill, let's take it from the policy level to the ground.
Yeah.
I know that it was certainly harder than I thought it was going to be to start a school. And
You're right.
the number of things that I knew nothing about, from the real estate and the renovation angle to the curriculum development to the HR side and concerning myself with benefits and all these new areas that I knew nothing about. Tell me what the biggest challenges for you have been, and why don't you give me one pleasant surprise and one unpleasant surprise?
Wow, pleasant surprise would be children and families. I think one of the things we learned pretty early on is that even though many of the students who attend our school come from similar neighborhoods, similar backgrounds, the diversity of needs and expectations within that group are certainly, it's certainly something that we didn't expect. I mean, children and families who come from underserved or poor communities we think of them as these monolithic groups, and they're just, nothing could be further from the truth. They have different opinions, families have different needs, and that was certainly surprising to us. And the thing that we found in that was really great is that, you know, so many of those parents want great things for their kids. They may not know what excellence looks like. They may not have experienced it in their own academic experiences, but or careers, but man, they want great things for their kids. And so that was a pleasant surprise because we found some early partners in the development of our school, which is really important. You have to have a core group of families that are going to be with you. The things that are surprisingly, that were difficult and surprised us, it's just the complexities of operating a public charter school. They are really complex institutions to operate, in part because of the diverse needs of kids, but also because of all of the bureaucratic red tape that, you know, no matter how you slice it, you know, money is time. We spend a lot of time learning, trying to figure out how we pursue our vision for this school, but also stay accountable to things like, you know, the MSEP 5, you know, this ridiculous APR that tells us nothing about the performance of schools. But these are things and policies behind those things. They certainly drive the behavior of people within a school building. And sometimes those things can be really negative for kids because the APR measure has absolutely nothing to do with kids and preparing them for this 21st century that we live in.
And yet a lot of adults spend a lot of time figuring out how to game the APR,
how to game the
when
APR.
they could be
absolutely
doing curriculum development and the,
right.
you know, for the right reasons, or
preparing kids to think critically,
yeah.
being focused on school culture, being focused on whether or not kids are happy and safe within that school building. Absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of things that certainly the APR falls short of measuring. And because we have a, you know, I might get in trouble for this, but because we have a local advocacy group, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, that promotes this as the end-all and be-all of school performance, the general public thinks that that rating actually means something, and it means nothing at all when you get down to the school level, what's happening to kids inside of our public schools.
So I was struck by something you said. You know, you talked about, you know, just the fact that kids in under-resourced, you know, neighborhoods and growing up with very little, you can't, it's not a monolithic group. And one of the things that I found when I represented a district that was majority black, but close to 50-50, and did a lot of canvassing on the north side and the south side. And the one thing that struck me more than anything was that no matter what side of Del Mar I was on, everybody wanted the same exact thing, which was safe neighborhoods and better schools.
Yeah.
How do you find the parents who approach you and are saying, we want, you know, better schools? What do they mean when they say better schools? And how, you know, and how do you define quality?
Wow, that is a tough question. Let's start with the parents. So it runs the gamut. For some parents, a better school is a place where their kids are safe and they learn to read and write, learn to do math, and that's it. I mean, that's their definition of a great school. We have some parents, and we have an interesting question on our pre-enrollment application. You know, tell us about your hopes and dreams for your kids. What do you want to, you know, achieve in your partnership with the Biome School? And for some parents, again, it's basic. I want them to learn to read. I want them to learn to do mathematics. For some parents, it's I want them to be in a place in which their creativity is recognized and they have the opportunity to explore that while they learn. So again, you have these different opinions of what a great school is.
How do you try to balance that, kind of those demanding kind of the rigor,
yeah.
you know, of a traditional STEAM education,
sure.
and those who are looking for the creativity of their children to be nurtured?
In part by individualizing as much as we possibly can. I think that's the key, and certainly I think, you know, rigor is really important, but along with that, kids have to actually enjoy school. You know, we're trying to create lifelong learners, and if kids go into a school where it's you know, I'll tell this story. I was meeting with an official of our local public school, and around this topic of science education, and he was explaining how the kids hated science, and I said, well, do you have science labs? You know, is it experiential, and is the approach experiential? And well, no, we don't have that, and science consisted of workbooks and worksheets. And why would kids be excited about that? I mean, we live at a time where we're fighting for, if you have kids, you know you fight for their attention in everything that you do in your home. And we need to change our approaches within school. Kids have to enjoy being there in order to develop this love for learning. And so, again, those are some of the things that we do very well. You know, experiential learning, partnering. We have a great pilot program that we're in our second year of operating with the St. Louis Zoo. But it's, again, about taking down the four walls of our school, and at the Biome School, you know, what would school look like if it took place in the larger community? And we're really exploring that in some interesting and unique ways, especially for the state of Missouri. So we're excited about that. But excellence for us is about high standards first and foremost, building a strong foundation of literacy and math with kids, but also, again, developing that character, developing that love of learning, and allowing kids to pursue education through their own passions.
Great, great. Thank you. So Chuck, as a guy who's spent a long time in the virtual education world, how do you define quality?
Well, I think I would embrace a lot of what Bill said, especially when you can reduce it down or bring it down to the level of the student and their family. A lot of education is about progress. It's not about a static endpoint, which is what a lot of the assessments try to capture. So quality is providing an environment where those students, as they learn, can see demonstrated progress in their academics, and knowing that they're being challenged through strong curriculum, through engaged instruction, through a lot of support. So very much, I mean, I think the misnomer of the virtual learning world is, in many ways, it's very similar to any other type of school. It's just that you've created a different learning environment and a different means of accessing and interacting with the instructors and the administrators. So it's in some ways, it's very much like the traditional model.
So given some of the things that Bill said about the battle for kids' attention, you know, my kids, you know, they're four and 6, and they come and jump on me at about 5:45 every morning. And once I'm awakened to the point that I can't go back to sleep, then they say, "Where's your phone? Where's your tablet?" Right? They're, you know, getting sustained attention from them is increasingly difficult. How do you, I guess, how do you balance the competing imperatives of wanting to, you know, obviously educate kids and prepare them for a world of highly sophisticated technology, but also ensure that they master the type of soft skills that are so important in a professional setting when it comes to emotional intelligence and, you know, just learning how to interact successfully?
That's a great question, you know, and in the virtual world, as it's evolved, virtual learning's evolved over the last decade and a half. It initially started out mostly attracting individuals who came out of a home-based learning environment previously, homeschoolers, et cetera, right? And what you've seen is, as it evolved into the higher grade levels, and especially high school, a lot of those needs became very evident. And so I know for the schools that we assist, they spend a significant amount of time and resources and personnel focused on those very things around social emotional learning and providing the support and advocacy systems and policies in place to ensure that those very things are available to those students, and that they can grab on. Because what you don't want is, you don't want isolation, right? And that's where sometimes virtual can lead to that. But we also know that this system is most effective when there is a very strong adult involved in supporting that effort. You know, back to your point about the passion of the parent, right, behind things. And when the learning coach, whether it be a parent or a guardian, is there supporting that student, a lot of exciting things can happen. The one advantage of the virtual model is it flips the paradigm of learning, and it makes time the variable and learning the constant, as opposed to saying everybody gets 52 minutes for English and then the bell rings and you move to math. You can do things in a shorter amount of time with that concentration, so that flexibility of time and creates a lot of opportunities for developing and working on some of those other areas.
Yeah, no, I'm seeing already with my kindergartner that his misbehavior comes when he's bored. Right. You know, and so if he needs 26 minutes for 52 minutes of work, but he has to sit there for 52 minutes, that's why he's causing issues. Conversely, some kids will need 126 minutes to master something, and the virtual model helps them not be stigmatized for maybe needing some extra nurturing. So this is all really helpful for me. I'm learning a lot from all of you. So let me go back up to the policy level for a few minutes, and we'll start with you, Chuck, and then kind of move around. There have been several attempts to pass a virtual school bill here in Missouri, but none has succeeded yet. Tell us, number one, why this is important for choice, and number two, what the prospects are this session.
Okay. Well, I think it's important for choice because, as several individuals have alluded and stated directly, when you get down to the individual level of the student, they all bring their unique path to the learning process. Their personality, their learning style, their home environment, all of the factors that come into play as to whether and how a student is successful. And for 85% probably of the student population, the traditional brick and mortar model can be sufficient. But there are a lot of individuals at both, and the virtual model tends to attract individuals at the extremes. Either those who are bored and want to accelerate and learn more and be more challenged, and they don't have the resources at their school or the AP classes or the physics class, or they're just, like you said, bored because they're being held back and they don't have the opportunity to move forward, and so they actually don't achieve what they could. Or you have those individuals who are being forced into a system that just kind of drives everybody at the same pace with the same response, and they've got particular needs either around their learning style, their social life, their health conditions, whatever. They need something different. I mean, and the reality is we live in a world of choice now. Most of us grew up in a time where there were 3 car manufacturers. There was
networks.
Were networks on TV. Yeah. There was 8 Bell systems. You didn't have choice. It was just, everything was just presented to you, and everybody learned to live within that environment. But then when choice opens up, people begin to evaluate and make decisions that align with what are their best interests. And I would say that the individuals who are most able to make the best decision would be the parent, who's closest to the child, definitely not an official in Jeff City, and definitely not a bureaucrat in Washington. So now Missouri's interesting. I mean, they do allow virtual education at the district level, and you can use virtual schools, but Missouri's got 521 districts, right? They're very fragmented. And the reality is that very few of the districts take advantage of that. So I think one of the issues is that people think, well, we already have virtual in the state. Districts can do that, but the problem is that not many take advantage of it because they don't have the resources or the expertise. I think the prospects for this year, we are getting close. We're getting closer because I think people recognize that there are needs, and we're really, just like the expansion of charters or ESAs, we are a supplemental enhancement of the educational landscape. We're not a replacement of what currently exists. We're actually,
But of course, there's going to be that fear
there is.
among a lot of
Right,
education
and
professionals.
I think through education, I think through the testimony of, when it becomes personal to individuals, when legislators or superintendents have firsthand, and I'll just finish with this, when we opened the Insight School of Kansas, our executive director was a former superintendent of the year in Kansas, had been an administrator for almost 40 years, very well regarded. The first year, he was like he was Darth Vader. He had gone to the dark side. And all the other superintendents were bringing out the same old arguments of you're stealing kids, you're taking money, and by the third year, they were sending kids to us who they knew this was a better fit. They were actually partnering with us. We were the science department, the language department for rural districts that could not provide that on their own. So I think over time, when it becomes personal and you can develop the relationships and you can tell the stories, they'll begin to see that this doesn't completely blow up education. It actually enriches it, much like the charter movement does, right, to enhance quality across the board and provides better options for kids at the end of the day, which is really what we're after.
Yeah. So, Robin, last year the charter school expansion bill made it out of the House but died in the Senate. Can you talk about exactly what that bill did and what kind of legislation in the realm you think will be filed and what its specific prospects are this year?
Sure. I'm pretty confident that we're going to see charter school expansion language be introduced again this year. Rebecca Raber was an incredible champion in the House last year for us, and I mean, she's really just devoted, wonderful woman who I suspect will bring equal amounts of passion to this next this session that's only a few weeks away now. So that bill included accountability and expansion. So right now, charter schools can only operate in St. Louis Public School District and the Kansas City Public School District, and anywhere in the state where there's an unaccredited school district or has been provisionally accredited for a set amount of time. And if you've been tracking the unaccredited nature of things, we are actually no longer have an unaccredited district. That doesn't mean we have all high-performing districts. Those are very different things. Success, right? That's exactly. We declared it, and so there it is.
There it is.
That's all it takes. So we have about 900,000 kids in the state of Missouri. If you look at the state test, about 40% of those kids are not reading at grade level. If you look at NAEP, which is the national test that samples, about 60% of the kids are not reading at grade level in fourth grade. So, and about 60% of the kids did not make proficient or advance on the math test last year. So around 400,000 kids in the state of Missouri right now are not reading or counting at grade level, and someone needs to help them. And we believe charter schools are an opportunity. People like Bill, people like Chuck, we think we can get them great opportunities in a different way that they're currently not getting through their district. That does not mean that kids aren't seeing success in their district. And unfortunately, I think that's what the argument becomes, much like what we've already heard, that we're going to steal the kids, go in the middle of the night and make the child go to a charter school. It's really, sign up for school, coming out of the closet under the bed. It's crazy talk. But that's this feeling about what's ours as opposed to the children belong to the parents. Look, people with means have always had choice. What we're really trying to do is make sure that families don't have to leave the communities that they love or take out more debt or mortgage. Somebody was telling me in a meeting today where we had about, Frank, you heard that number too, about 30% premium on mortgages for a performing district. So if you have the money, you can buy a good public school. And that's really not what public school's about. So what are our chances this year? It's going to be tough. The issue with the State Board of Education, I think, is going to, the appointments of those new members will probably take up a lot of time and I think make people feel bad. And that will make it hard to do this hard work. I would say that we also have a problem with some of the quality of our charter schools, to be honest. And if we don't have high-performing schools, that makes us susceptible politically to not being able to expand statewide. So I think that's a little bit of some self-policing that needs to happen. One of the accountability measures that I expect to see again this year, which I'm actually really in support of, is an automatic closure. If schools aren't performing over a series of years, so if you've been renewed at the last charters have 5-year contracts, and if you're at that 5th year and you're really not a high performing, you would get 3 more years. But within that time, if you continue not to be a performing school, then you'll automatically close at the 3rd year after. And I think that's a reasonable amount of time. I think Bill would tell you 8 years is you should have your act together by then, and we should, and then we should actually make sure that those kids have a different opportunity then. We want to continue to and use those facilities and community partners to make sure that we bring about better public schools for them. So I think that's the trade-off. Can we go statewide? Can we add some more accountability that's meaningful? Will we be able to have this debate? I think that we'll see.
Thanks for your courageous prediction. Mike, what are the 2 things that evidence tells us we should do that policymakers either in Missouri or nationally are not listening to, not reading, and whether it's a willful ignorance or whether it's just, they're not up to speed?
Well, I think the evidence for school choice, both private school choice and charter schools, particularly urban charter schools, is pretty strong. If you look at the randomized control trials of school vouchers, just make sure that everybody knows why RCTs are the gold standard. Yeah, so a randomized control trial is like the highest level of social science you can do, where you take a group of students who want to participate in a program, you chop the group in half via random lottery. Half the kids get a school voucher, half the kids don't. So you can't say that these kids are different or they're more motivated or that they're any of those things. The only thing that separates those two is random chance. Because when you study school choice, the biggest thing you have to deal with is selection bias. Are the kids who select into a school different than the kids who don't? So randomized control trial is really, there are other ways to approximate it, and a lot of the charter school literature has had to kind of approximate it. But school voucher literature, because it's such an intense topic, there have been tons of these RCTs that have been done, and I'm thinking, there's, I think 11 of them have found positive results for at least not some group, all of the students. 1 found a null result and 1 found a negative result. But then actually the one that found a negative result was down in Louisiana, and it was published after just 1 year of data. As researchers have followed those children for longer, it's actually going away. It's now sort of a null, and if trends continue, it'll go up. So I think that's something. I think on the charter school side as well. There was that great piece when Massachusetts was talking about increasing its charter school cap. Sue Donarski from the University of Michigan wrote a piece for the New York Times called, I think it's called Schools That Work, where she does it, in 800 words, goes through this whole literature where, it's just consistently via randomized control trial or other approximation strategies have shown benefits for the students that participate. But I think it's also important, particularly on the private school choice side, there are also lots of studies that don't just look at students' test scores. The strongest results that we see are actually in attainment and later life outcomes. More likely to graduate from high school, more likely to matriculate in college. The charter school research is starting to get there just because you need the data sets to be able to follow kids long enough. And a lot of the things that people worry about, and something that I'm particularly interested in, I think we probably all should be given the moment that we're in right now, are civic outcomes. A big worry that people have about private school choice, in the Supreme Court case that decided Zellman versus Simmons-Harris, the dissenting judges said, we fear this balkanization, that if we allow people to go to different schools, be they religious schools or independently operated public schools or any of those, that people will retreat back into these silos. And it turns out, we actually have data on these outcomes, and it's not true. In fact, in many cases, students who've gone to private schools or who have used these programs are more likely to do things like vote or volunteer. They score higher on ratings of political tolerance and a lot of these other issues that I think we should really care about. And what, sort of pivoting from your question for a second, one thing that I think is actually important, and even though by training I'm a social scientist, and so hearing numbers about kids who can't read or do math I think is really important, I think that actually the strength when we talk about school choice now, either private school choice or charter schools and others, is the value, the distinctly American value of pluralism, and how it's incredibly important in so many other facets of our lives, we allow for a plural set of institutions to serve people. Yeah. So we think about, hospitals, right? They're religiously affiliated hospitals. They're all of those things exist, and we would never say, oh, you can't take your Medicaid dollars to Barnes Jewish Hospital. We never say, you can't take the GI Bill to Notre Dame. Yet for this one really, strange part of it, kids ages 5 to 18, we say, no, it needs to be sort of directly operated by the state and run by it. And I think it's sort of an un-American way of looking at this issue. And so creating a more pluralistic system that allows people to have schools that reflect their values, that reflect their culture, that reflect the things that they want to see inculcated in their children can actually be something that has knock-on social benefits. Not just that kids will be better at reading and writing and doing math, but that they'll be better citizens, they'll have more respect for their fellow citizens, and understand there are people that are different from them, and that's okay, and we can all get along with one another.
Yeah, thank you. So I want people in the audience to start thinking of questions, and I'm going to go to Bill for a last question from me, and that's sort of a corollary to the question I asked Mike. What are the 2 things that you wish legislators knew in terms of realities on the ground before they made education policy from 30,000 feet?
Well, I think first and foremost, they should understand that schools are open systems. And so a public school inherits all of the issues within the community that it serves. And you have to take that into account when you create policy, first and foremost. And secondly, I wish the legislators would understand that when they create policy, there are a myriad of unintended consequences as a result of that. You talked about No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top, and we've seen issues with that, with administrators falsifying data. Sure. We've seen teachers and administrators focused on the kids who are at that cut line of proficiency, leaving out the kids at the top and the bottom. So these are the kinds of things that happen. But in addition to all that, there are groups all over the country, Progressive Policy Institute and others, that are doing great work around accountability. And legislators need to start to look at that. The recommendations for expanding the way we look at accountability, but also the ways in which we measure school performance are really important. And the last thing I'll say is that, understanding that the outcomes of schools and education can be measured in that K-12 span, as you discussed earlier. It's about whether or not those folks are able to become contributors to society. And we need to start looking at the long game and building schools and choice to meet the needs of our kids, focused on that long game instead of this short run with this test score that the kids happen to take on this particular day, and let that be the measure of how we're performing. I think we're afraid to actually know how our schools are actually performing. I think we don't want to know as a community, because education is what I've found that it is so tough and it's so complicated that we'd rather push our kids into schools, say those schools are accredited by some arbitrary measure, and then everybody feels good. Yep. When the truth of the matter is that education has to be something that is tackled by the community at large, and we need to take down the school silos because they're not working.
I love what you say about just legislators, policymakers need to immerse themselves in the research. Yep. It's like, you wouldn't go onto a plane and say, "Excuse me, Captain, I'll take it from here." No. You wouldn't go into an operating room and say, "I got this." Like I was operated on once, but legislators all the time would say, "I went to school for 16 years. Yeah. Don't tell me what works." I heard that all the time, right? Yeah,
so absolutely.
All right, questions from the audience. Sir? Yeah.
Jeff, this is kind of going to what you said about early childhood education, which I'm a big believer in. There was a stat that heard multiple times that 85% of a child's brain is already formed by age 4 or 5. And I may get these stats a little bit wrong. But early childhood education doesn't seem to have a big place in what the legislator wants to do. So is there anything going on in that to change that? And maybe the things that happened in the past that didn't get through, and why didn't they?
So question is about early childhood education in the legislature, recognizing the outsized percentage of neurological development that occurs before kindergarten. Why don't we do more on early childhood? I know that former Senator Joe Keaveney had focused on this as a legislator and had passed legislation that would say that if the foundation formula is fully funded, then we'll spend more money on pre-K. And we actually funded the altered or the slightly amended foundation formula for the first time last fiscal year. Robin, do you want to take it from there?
So I think it's about 4% of the early childhood population will be paid for through the formula, and it's really income-based. So it's not universal, but it's a beginning. I'm not sure how happy everybody is about this right now, because the foundation formula is funded without those students being put into the formula, because it's in the rears. It's the year before's enrollment. So the per pupil gets diminished if you put the early childhood folks into it. And so it's a bit of a struggle. I think it was actually the right thing to do, is to have early childhood added in partially to the foundation formula, but I'm really concerned, frankly, to some of your points earlier, that if it's only through the K-12 system that we're delivering early childhood, I think we're missing a huge opportunity. There are a lot of great community-based organizations that do work now that are doing actually better work than many school districts. And they actually look at the latest science, and they're accredited on national levels, and they're engaging families. They're by work, not necessarily by where the person lives, and so they're more convenient to families. How are we going to hold early childhood accountable? That's going to be the next big struggle about that. And
the QRS bill that's been around for about a decade,
right.
like to establish
Lots
a
of
quality
battles.
rating system for early childhood facilities. So that's really...
So that was repealed. We had a prohibition against a QRS, and that's been repealed. But I think these are going to be fundamental community questions. I think, frankly, it's a spanking issue. For some families, spanking is still something that they think is part of what you do to rear a young child. For many early childhood experts in the accreditation field, that is actually an oppositional piece. And so if you want to support community-based and church-based early childhood programs through state money, then you're going to have this argument about, it really is a very fundamental argument right now about rearing children and using that method of discipline.
Well, I think there's a debate in general when it comes to pre-K of what is the purpose of it.
Yeah.
Is socialization of students? Is it academic preparation? Frankly, the degree to which it's childcare for working families, which is not nothing. I think that's something that's important to be put into there. So before any of that sort of happens, a real debate, we have to really discuss, so wait, what's the point of this? And I think the danger, and I'm a person who's pro pre-K and expanding it to more students, is that if we have a K-12 system that we don't think is doing so hot, simply appending another grade or two at the beginning, it's not clear to me why we think that would meet with great success. So I think thinking about, what lessons have we learned in K-12? And how can we apply those lessons that we've learned if we had a chance to, in some ways, sort of start fresh with a program for 1 or 2 grades of children at their early years?
And I think it never would have passed in the first place if legislators had any inkling that we would have ever fully funded the formula. And it was only the amendment to the formula that allowed this to actually get some money. So, all right, thank you for the great question. Sir?
Yeah, I was wondering, a couple of states have experimented with virtual classrooms. I think Indiana and Tennessee are 2 of them. What can Missouri learn from those experiments?
Chuck, why don't you take that?
What do you mean by experimenting with virtual classrooms, though? There are 32 states that allow open enrollment for virtual education across the state. Missouri is a handful of 5 states that utilize virtual education, but they confine it to the district level. There isn't open enrollment. There's about 8 states that don't allow virtual learning in any format. The majority of the states have moved toward and most of them were early adopters of it as being another option for students in schools. But what do you mean by experiment?
Well, I'm just sort of trying to understand, like, what steps should Missouri take in order to make the virtual classroom more available across the state?
Well, I think the fact that they already recognize that because they allow districts already to use virtual courses and even stand up their own virtual school, there's been a recognition that this is a reasonable and viable learning option for kids within that district. I just think the next step is allowing that expansion to include kids, especially from those districts that don't have the resources. You know, the real equity issue in many respects goes to the rural students and the small schools that don't have the personnel, they don't have the resources of expertise to even embrace virtual learning, to know how it's utilized. So by allowing districts that can already offer these programs, stand up programs that either kids can enroll in full time across the state, or as we do in many states, we partner with other districts and allow them to have the opportunity to utilize those resources. So I think it's just expansion.
Yeah, it would seem to me that allowing virtual education and limiting it to the district is defeating pretty much the whole purpose of virtualization.
Well, and the value of it being at the district level is that entity is already regulated. Or charter schools could also have their own. And so you already have these programs within the regulatory framework. So expanding it and allowing them to take on a broader audience should be easy.
But to Bill's earlier comment about some of the, the weight of the bureaucracy on schools to actually implement some of these things, it's still, as it stands today, virtual education programs within districts look very much like the district. So you talked about, I had my kids in all sorts of different schools. One of my children wanted to accelerate and not spend time in a health class. And so she wanted to take it over the summer. So we went through the district's virtual program, St. Louis Public School District, and we had to pay for it. So even though we're in a public school, even though we wanted our child to have access to an accelerated education program, our family actually had to pay for it. So that's the first thing. The second one is it was regulated on pace. So she could have gotten the program finished in about 10 days, but because of the way that it's regulated, she could not take a midterm for 3 weeks. And then she had to wait 3 more weeks to take a final. That kind of thinking about a semester is not how kids think. I'm going to get this done. And so I think that's going to be part of the work that we all need to do in that policy question. I mean, we've got to have the voices of families and of the practitioners to say that stop this insanity. When we do advance this work, let's do it in a way that really actually meets the needs of the people who are using it today.
Absolutely. I think as long as we continue to have policy that does not reflect the diversity in terms of needs of children and families, we're going to have the same thing now, 20 years from now, that we have now. It's a failing public education system. And so I think that, that again, when we think about the policy for the 21st century, it has to be a lot more malleable than it is today. And how do you get legislatures to think that way?
What country does it best?
God, that's a
because we're like when I see like the 17 industrialized democracies on various, we're usually 13th, 14th, 15th.
Finland's the one we always
Finland.
talk about.
That's what we talk about. But but that's for Finland.
Homogeneous
Yeah,
population.
Yeah.
It's really good for Finland. That's right. Good for the Finns.
Yeah.
The size of Connecticut.
All right, time for one last question.
I've looked at other states around the country and how they've passed school choice and charter school bills through their legislature, and there's usually some level of bipartisan support. In Missouri, that really hasn't been the case. We barely got 82 Republican votes to pass what, in my opinion, was one of the weakest charter school bills I've ever seen. Why do you think we aren't getting any bipartisanship on this issue, and how do you think we can change that here?
First of all, because I left.
The momentum went away.
That's right.
Look, I think one issue, Missouri, to my knowledge, I think one of only 3 states that geographically limits charter schools. I think it's us, maybe Ohio and Delaware. I think we're the only folks that do that. So part of what we have to do now, yeah, an inauspicious group to be, nothing, sorry if anybody's here from Delaware, but odds are you probably aren't. No, but so part of the issue that we have there is that, the children that are being served and the great stories that we hear from the wonderful schools are regionally isolated in these 2 areas. And so it's more difficult to make the case in, I think, other communities around the state, in lots of other states that want to either expand charter schools or get access to facilities, or a lot of the kind of next generation charter school laws that are happening. They're able to point to schools all around the state and in different legislators' districts and say, oh, look, there's one of these schools in your districts. Don't you want to help them get a nicer building? And look, I mean, I think just as sort of a person who was trained as a political scientist as well, right now in Missouri, we have children who benefit from these programs that are overwhelmingly, or I think exclusively, in areas that send Democrats to Jefferson City. And we have the political support that has none of the children that are generally Republicans that are out there. Like, that's not a recipe for like a long-term political coalition, right? Just in strictly political terms. So one of 2 things has to happen. So either more Democrats need to get on board there, and you're all doing the Lord's work doing that, trying to make that happen, or more two, yeah, or we've got to have children benefit from these programs in Republican parts of the state, and they can. As you know, the sort of fundamental idea of CEAM is that there's no better advocate than the actual families who benefit from these programs. So folks need to have them within their constituencies to speak to them.
I'm going to say,
So-
I'm going to say I'm not sure we're going to see a bipartisan bill, and I don't really care about that anymore. I mean, I think, well,
Her
because
husband was the chairman of the city Democratic Party for about over a decade.
Yeah. So I'll probably get divorced. I'll be served papers when I get home. But because we'll wait for the Tuesday after never to get that, and then we'll still be facing the fundamental political problem that we're facing, which is 518 superintendents, school boards, 7-member school boards. It's the education industrial complex, right? And so these folks see charter schools as a way of taking their jobs away. And that competition, it's a fascinating thing when you talk to superintendents of high-performing districts. Oh, it won't be us. I mean, I know our children are really happy. I'm really, but it would also cost me if 100 kids left. I mean, at $12,000 a kid, I mean, that would be real damage. So you believe that you have a right to ownership of those families. That's a little bit of a problem. And that you really don't believe in the faith of your own product, that somebody coming in next door is actually going to take the kids out of your classrooms. You can't have it both ways. And so I think our fundamental problem is going to be the same fundamental problem whether we have a bipartisan program or not. We have been incredibly helpful. Lots of people helped us in the House last year, but the Speaker's leadership is essential. And I think that's really where I think leadership matters, and whatever party it is going to help us get this bill out of both sides. If we have the kind of leadership in the Senate that we've had in the House, then I think we'll be successful.
Let me just kind of address this from 2 angles very quickly. In the city, too many legislators. It's very easy to listen to the most vocal people. And when the teachers union speaks louder and is more in your ear than parents, you tend to listen to the teachers union. They're more proximate to you. There's more people in Jeff City, representing the education roundtable than there are representing parents, of kids in charter schools. And until that changes, you're going to have a hard time turning many Democrats from the urban areas. Conversely, but analogously, in the rural areas, so many of the rural areas of Missouri are so decimated economically that the only 2 things they have going for them are the school district and the prison. And that's why they're so conservative, tough on crime, and it's why they're, in many cases, send anti-charter school legislators there, because the most prominent citizen in the district of a House member with 36,000 people and is the biggest employer. And when all your factories have closed, that's going to be the superintendent. And so, you've got these crazy political dynamics that Mike outlines, but until you remedy those two kind of structural issues, in the urban and rural areas, it's going to be hard to make this a true bipartisan issue.
Missouri has one of the largest legislatures in the country, and so on the House side, it shrinks that dynamic even smaller.
That's right.
I mean, it's and especially in the rural areas, there are only a few voices that they can listen to, and it's generally the education voice.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the dynamic. It's a amazing but strange
So
dynamic.
I think this is so cool that we've had the perspective of a guy working in the industry, a guy on the ground, starting a school, a gal making policy, and one of the leading experts in the state and the nation studying it and telling us what works and what doesn't. What a cool, eclectic mix of people we were blessed to hear from tonight. And thank you all for being here.